We are excited to have MacKenzie Patton presenting today on diseases and disorders in vegetable gardens. MacKenzie is an integrated pest management advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in the Sierra Foothills. She is a Texas native who came to California for graduate school to study insect-vectored plant diseases. Since school, she has worked with a variety of insects and diseases on both ornamental and agricultural plants. When she isn't working, she likes to go hiking with her dog and husband. Thank you for joining us, MacKenzie. You may now share your slides and begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm here to talk about the common plant diseases and disorders that you might see in your vegetable garden. Hopefully from this webinar, you'll be more familiar with the symptoms and of common abiotic disorders and disease in vegetable crops that you might have in your gardens. We're going to briefly discuss some plant pathology refreshers, and then move on to those common disorders and diseases and their management. And at the end, we're kind of going to talk about tying it all together and how to take what you see and make an informed decision in your garden. There we go. Okay, again, plant pathology refresher. So what is plant pathology? Plant pathology is a study of plant diseases and disorders. Specifically, we study what causes the diseases and disorders, how they may occur and how they spread, and lastly, how we can prevent, treat, and manage diseases and disorders in different plants. So a plant disease is any abnormal condition of a plant that has a biotic or infectious origin. So plant diseases are caused by pathogens or infectious agents, and the majority of plant pathogens are fungi, oomycetes, bacteria, viruses and viroids, nematodes, and we also study parasitic plants in plant pathology because they behave similarly to pathogens. Now, in the plant pathology world, 75 to 85% of diseases are due to fungi, so we end up talking about them a lot. Oomycetes are, historically, we've thought that they were fungi, but oomycetes or water molds, through genetics, we've found that they're actually more similar to brown algae. But we still kind of group them in with fungi just because we've been doing that historically for some time. Viruses and viroids. So viroids, if you're not familiar, they're very similar to viruses, but they don't have this protein coat that the rest of viruses have. So they're more like naked genetic material that happens to be infectious. And nematodes are ubiquitous. They're widespread, they're everywhere, and only a small number of nematodes are actually plant parasites that cause diseases, the most common of which is root knot nematode. So disorders, on the other hand, are non-infectious and have environmental causes. They're abnormal conditions due to abiotic or environmental natures or factors. The most common factors or sources of abiotic disorders in plants are nutrient levels in the soil pH levels, which relates very closely to the nutrients, water management, too much or too little water, air quality and pollution, sun exposure, either too much or too little, and then that temperature, extreme temperatures exposures and prolonged extreme temperatures exposures. Now, I want to touch on just a couple problems with that complicate the nutrient issue, one of which I said that pH is very related to nutrients, and in that the pH of the soil changes the availability of certain nutrients to the plants. So most of our soils are around that 7 pH, where it is optimal for the plant to pick up those nutrients. So oftentimes when you have a pH issue, you'll have a nutrient issue as well because of the inability for the plant to pick up those nutrients. Additionally, with nutrients, mobility is involved, and this has to do with the movement of that nutrient, either in soil or in the plant material itself. Some nutrients are very mobile in the soil, which means they can be washed out pretty regularly or easily through irrigation. Other nutrients that are mobile in the plant the plant, when they begin to run low on that nutrient, they'll move the nutrient from their older leaves to the newer leaves so that you'll start seeing those deficiencies in the older leaves first versus the nutrients like manganese and iron that are less mobile in the plant. You'll start seeing issues in the youngest tissues. And then the last factor involved in nutrients that kind of complicates it is antagonism. So certain nutrients, if they're in excess, will antagonize the plant's ability to pick up other nutrients. So if you have excess nitrogen, that can impact the plant's ability in affinity to take up potassium and copper. And on the right, that is a diagram kind of showing that if you have too much calcium, manganese, zinc, or phosphorus, that could inhibit the plant's ability to get iron. So a lot of times you might have a visible deficiency that could be caused from a number of different reasons. You might have an adequate amount in the soil, but perhaps there's too much of another nutrient or your pH is off. The last thing I want to talk about, just as a refresher for plant pathology, is signs and symptoms. These are very important in helping you identify what you have going on in front of you. A symptom is the visible effect of a disease or a disorder on the plant. This is how the plant is responding either to that environmental cause or that biotic cause. So this includes things like wilting, leaf spot, poor growth, stunting, rot, and cankers on woody plants. A sign is a physical evidence of a pathogen, and this would obviously point more to a disease, as that is the physical sign of the infectious agent on the plant. So these are visible spores, mushrooms, and even bacterial ooze in the case of things like bacterial canker on tomato. So now I want to get into some common abiotic disorders that you might see in your veggie garden. So sun scald and heat damage are some of the most common disorders here in a sunny state of California. There's a specific difference between the two. Sun scald is when there's excessive direct exposure to sunlight. It generally will occur on leaves and fruit that are most exposed to the sun, and this may appear as bleached or browned lesions on those most exposed leaves and fruit. It may also appear as burning on leaves, depending on your crop type. Heat damage, on the other hand, is the prolonged exposure to high temperatures, and is often related to irrigation and water supply, as well as the actual high temperature itself. And this can affect the whole plant, and more than just the most exposed plants, or leaves and fruit. It can cause symptoms such as tip burn, fruit shrivel, leaf roll, and wilting. So the image in the center there with squash, those are heat damage from prolonged heat exposure, temperature exposure, and not direct sunlight. The fruit shriveled and aborted itself as opposed to being able to complete its fruit production cycle. This is a very common on peppers and tomato fruit. So frost and cold exposure are similar in that they're to heat and sun scald damage, in that they're very specifically different things. So frost damage is that exposure to actually freezing temperatures. It's the ice crystals that form in the plant cells, and it causes those cells to burst, and it will cause cell death and necrosis. And so that can look as the youngest tissues entirely shriveling and turning necrotic and wilting. It can also appear in things like lettuce, as seen in this picture of burst sections and kind of discolored sections. And that's those individual cells bursting from that exposure to cold. To frost. Prolonged exposure to cold temperatures, on the other hand, is just exposure to cold temperatures below the optimal. And this can cause, it doesn't necessarily cause plant cell death, but can cause distortion or discoloration. So the example I have here is basil on that top right picture. They're basil leaves that were exposed to not freezing, but cold, prolonged cold temperatures. So it caused a discoloration and a deformation of the leaves. So next we have irrigation. Irrigation and water management is a very tricky problem because excessive and deficient water can cause very similar symptoms in most plants. That is the wilting or yellowing and eventual crop death. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that excessive water will kill root tissues from lack of oxygen. And thereby you prevent those roots from taking up that nutrient and water to the plant because they have died from lack of oxygen. And this is pretty similar to if they were to die or not get enough water, so the plant can't bring up those nutrients and water to the tops of the plants. So because they're so similar, it's important always to check out your irrigation when you think you might have one of these problems. I do want to add, additionally, swings in moisture can cause issues in vegetable production because it can disrupt that fruit or crop production itself, and the development might become distorted or disrupted. So I want to move into a little bit about the abiotic nutrient examples here. Most home gardens will have necessary nutrient levels and the correct pH levels, but we'll touch on some of the more common issues that you might encounter, and these generally have to do with the mobility of the nutrients and if you repeat growing in a certain area, you might run low. So first, the biggest contender for plants is nitrogen. Nitrogen deficiency is going to be one of the most common ones, and that's just due to its high mobility in soil, so it can get washed out very easily by irrigation, and high rates of consumption. The plants use nitrogen to grow. When you have a lack of nitrogen, the overall symptoms will be chlorosis that starts generally on lower leaves, but it will progress through the plant. And the chlorosis can just be paling depending on the severity. So you might just get plants that are less deep green and they're more of a yellow green. And that can point to a chance that you have low nitrogen. The other macronutrient that plant uses, one of the other macronutrients, is phosphorus. So phosphorus isn't used quite as much and it's not as mobile in the soil. So deficiencies are generally less common, but deficiencies on vegetable and plant leaves can look like a few different things. You can just get smaller leaves in general, purpling and dulling in color in certain plants like tomatoes and strawberries. You'll get that purple color on the bottom sides of the leaves. The one thing I wanted to note about temperatures here is cold actually inhibits the plant's ability to uptake phosphorus. So sometimes when plants are too cold, they will appear as they're phosphorus deficient, even if there's enough in the soil because the plant wasn't able to take it up. Potassium is the last micronutrient we're going to talk about. It's very mobile in the soil, so you might see deficiencies if you repeat grow in a certain area and do not replenish the potassium. It's also very mobile in the plant, which means that the plant will move those from the older leaves and move it up as it starts getting lower in its levels. And what that will cause is the symptoms to develop on those lower leaves first. And this will look as tip burn or chlorosis or marginal burn across the board with your vegetable crops. Now, I mentioned that micronutrients will almost always be in adequate supply in home gardens. There are some more common micronutrient deficiencies, and these include iron, manganese, and zinc. They can occur if the pHs are slightly off, like I mentioned, or if there's an antagonism, like I had mentioned before. Generally speaking, all three of these will have a similar look in that it'll be interveinal chlorosis on the youngest tissues. Now, Sometimes zinc will be specifically bright around the mid ribs of the plant veins, and but it is important to kind of note here the only way you can truly confirm any kind of deficiency in your gardens would be to do a nutrient test on either the soil or your plant tissue through a commercial company. But this can kind of give you an idea of what the symptoms look like when or if you see them. So now I'm just going to briefly touch on some specific disorders in vegetable crops and how sometimes they can be caused by different multiple factors. Because tomatoes are one of the most commonly grown vegetables in vegetable gardens, I want to touch on a few specific fruit disorders, tomato fruit disorders. So we talked about sun scald, and I'm sure everyone knows blossom end rot, but blossom end rot is a very common, it's not just on tomatoes, it's on other solanaceous and cucurbits. Blossom end rot is due to imbalances in calcium levels that often relate to swings in moisture as well. And so oftentimes those two things are related that cause blossom end rot, which is when the fruit of, say, a tomato will begin to turn brown and die from the blossom end of the fruit. Now, in tomatoes, we also have cat facing. So this is when you get those distortions seen in the bottom right with those necrotic sections, and it's much more common on things like heirloom tomatoes. So cat facing can be due to temperature swings when the fruit is young, such as cool temperatures, cool and windy temperatures. It can also be due to swings in moisture and irrigation. And lastly, it can be due to excess nitrogen. And then the last tomato-specific thing I want to talk about is zippering, which is there on that left, which I think it looks a little cute, but it's basically when that fruit is being formed, one of the anthers that produce the pollen gets stuck, and it gets stuck through the fruit production process, and it just creates this innocuous little zipper that sometimes will have what looks like a dead piece of anther attached to it. You can kind of see the little, almost looks like a bow tie there. So for other solanaceous crops, there's quite a few issues that you may still encounter. Of course, sun scald, blossom end rot, blossom drop, which can also happen on tomatoes. Blossom drop is when the blossoms just fall off. They just go away. And this can be due to excess heat or cold, poor pollination, excess nitrogen, because nitrogen is going to push the plant to grow vegetatively and not necessarily for flower production. So blossom drop can be caused by a number of things. Potato hollow heart, excuse me. Potato hollow heart is a physiological disorder of potatoes where that center is hollow or browned out. It's not a solid potato all the way through. That can be, again, caused by weird environmental conditions during the potato growth. So excessive temperature swings, giant swings in moisture. Those are the main causes of potato hollow heart. Potato hollow heart. Say that 3 times fast. Incomplete pollination is something that can commonly happen on peppers. It's that image there. So you'll essentially get poor seed production and the fruit might be a little malformed, and that's just from a poor pollinator set. And then lastly, abiotic leaf roll can happen, and that's generally due from heat. Plants will just roll up their leaves because they get overheated. So moving on to cole crops, specifically broccoli has a few of its own that are particular of the cole crops. So buttoning is when you have those tiny little productions of just little baby broccoli heads instead of your nice full broccoli head. And this can be due to, from a few different factors, including excess cold, excess salt, insufficient water or insufficient nitrogen, and just poor yield from your broccoli can be due to those things. Brown bud, which is when you get that browning in the bottom right, that can be due to warm temperatures with excess calcium and rapid growth. So if it is a little too warm for the broccoli uh, optimally to grow, you can get rapid growth production, which just causes it to not to cause a little bit of necrosis in that center of the broccoli head. Hollow stem can happen on all cole crops. So this is just the stem of that cole crop will be weaker and hollow all the way through, and it's due to excess heat, but or excess nitrogen, or both. And then lastly, bolting. A lot of the cold season crops are easier to trigger bolting if it's too warm for them. And the bolting is just sending the plants into flower production before they're ready and before they're vegetatively grown out enough that they'll have a good yield. Next, we have specific disorders to cucurbits. So blossom end rot does happen on cucurbits, of course, sun scald, blossom drop. And then we have bitter fruit, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is primarily a problem in melons, and it's essentially the melons will produce a stress response compound because it's stressed either due to heat or drought or overwatering or poor soil fertility, and it causes that melon to not be as sweet. Measles of watermelon is when you get this speckling on the rind of watermelons, primarily due to over irrigation. And the last abiotic group disorder that we're going to talk about is the leafy greens. So leafy greens, again, they're in that cold crop, or they're in that cold crop production cycle. So frost damage can happen with them. And like in that picture I showed you, it'll look like those swollen burst cells with some necrosis if you do get that frost damage. You can get tip burn, and that can be due to excess salts, heat damage, a number of things. Ammonia injury is when you have an excess fertilizer in a specific ammonia form, which could be a nitrogen form, and that looks like this picture here on the right. The taproot of the leafy green will get damaged on the inside, and it's a little sensitive to ammonia type fertilizers. And then bolting again, which is due to warmer than optimal temperatures, which pushes the plant into a different physiological state. So, talked some about abiotic disorders. Now I'm going to move into just some common plant diseases that you might encounter in your veggie gardens and those management strategies that can be used to help mitigate those issues. The first disease I'm going to talk about is powdery mildew. We're probably all at least a little familiar with powdery mildew. It's a fungal disease that has many hosts and many actually different fungal species that cause it. Oftentimes, while it is a broad name, powdery mildew, for a disease, it is caused by specific fungi that may be very host specific. So they may infect only a single host species, or they may infect a similar or a group of similarly related host species. And the disease itself is the typical symptoms or signs, really, in this case, is that white powdery film that is on generally the tops or bottoms of the leaves. So one important thing about powdery mildew is while the season will start with a spring rain, and that's how that overwintering structure kind of triggers the spore release, after that, the fungus does not need high humidity, which, given that's the environment we tend to have in California, is some spring rains and then hot, powdery mildew is a very common problem in a lot of California. It does not require high humidity following and it can reinfect on the same plant or nearby plants throughout the season, which means that it is a polycyclic disease. You can see from these pictures it'll create those patches, and then the spores that it creates mid-season that can reinfect the same plant are the ones that we see and call powdery mildew itself. It's those fuzzy ones that you can actually visibly see as a sign on the plant. They do then create those little black spore-like overwintering. They create black resting structures that are survival structures, and the fungus will then survive in leaf litter over the winter or the non-growing season. Now, this fungus does thrive in moderate temperatures, and so when it gets excessively hot in our summers, this tends to back off and not be as big of an issue, unless unless the plant has a lot of shade, because then it can continue growing. So this fungus thrives in warm temperatures, generally with shade. Now, for dealing with powdery mildew, for the most part, there's resistant varieties depending on the types of plants that you are looking at. The different cultivars can have different sensitivities to powdery mildew, and so that's a good route to go if that is available in that crop. Cultural practices, increasing the sun availability to kill or to not allow that powdery mildew to grow as well, and then increasing that airflow and minimizing the leaf, how compact and how grouped together the leaves are to increase that airflow can help. Adding quick release fertilizer will encourage powdery mildew growth and disease. So sometimes if this is an issue, slow release fertilizer can be a cultural practice to help mitigate and lessen your powdery mildew problems. And of course, sanitation, cleaning up that leaf litter when your garden is done, or if you're starting to get powdery mildew infection, you can remove those leaves. So as for chemicals, they're almost always better. They're best used as preventatives, but there are things like horticultural oils and sulfur products that can be used. There's also some that biological fungicides that can be used as well. So there's some bacillus products. So this is using a bacteria to combat the fungus itself. I do want to add, always read those labels and make sure that the product you want to use can be used in your home garden. The next disease I'm going to talk about is downy mildew. So downy mildew is caused by a water mold, one of those oomycetes that I mentioned, and it is actually a few different genera as well. It's not a single type of fungus. These are also pretty host specific. Just like powdery mildew, it sometimes is very host specific and only infects one species, like that of downy mildew of grape. And on the other hand, there's some types of downy mildew that affect closely related plants, like the downy mildew of cucurbits will go to other cucurbits. So downy mildew favors cooler temperatures and high humidity and wet foliage. So in general, it is less of a problem in California if you have proper irrigation management and don't have too much overhead watering, or your plant's leaves aren't staying too wet for too long. Unlike powdery mildew, one important difference between downy mildew and powdery mildew is the spores and the mycelia will be only on the bottom of the leaves. And this is because they like the cooler area of the leaf. And so the tops of the leaves may have leaf spotting or chlorosis or necrosis and discoloration. Now, for prevention, there is some crops that do have resistance, but this is, again, something that if you have a problem with it, it's generally, it can be controlled with cultural controls in California. And this includes increasing that airflow, keeping the foliage of your plant dry as possible, whether that's through drip irrigation as opposed to overhead watering, or by removing excess leaves so that there's more airflow. Sanitation, removing diseased leaves and cleaning up after can also help keep that inoculum source down. And some downy mildews, if you have weeds that are closely related nearby, say brassicas, and you have mustards nearby, they can serve as reservoirs. So you want to remove those. Um, okay, so soft rots. Those gross bacterial diseases often caused by species of bacteria like Pectobacterium, Erwinia, and Pseudomonas species. These guys often have a really broad host range and can go to many different types. The most types of hosts that have most types of plant species that have issues with soft rots are those tubers or root or bulb vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and onions. Now, soft rot can also be an issue in some of your leafy greens that are really tight, like cabbages, because they're very tightly packed so that that bacteria can grow. And they're characterized by maceration of the host cell walls. And it just causes these really mushy, almost disintegrated tissue. And that is what we call a soft rot. So soft rots are water soaked and mushy and stinky and smelly. They thrive in warm and wet environments, and they generally get into that plant through either mechanical or insect damage. So one of the important control measures for this is minimizing the amount of damage that you may cause to the tubers or plants themselves. And sometimes this is through, you know, controlling those insect pests that might cause issues. So on the right, that's a tuber worm. And a tuber worm is a great example of a pest that is going to open up the door for bacteria to get in and ruin that entire potato. Over controlling irrigation and not over irrigating can help mitigate these problems as well, and improving air circulation to the plant in general. Having good drainage and if you do have an issue with it, rotating to something that is less susceptible, that doesn't have those bulb, corm, tuber, or root vegetables can help. And that sanitation, again, cleaning up those infected plants, but also preventing insect damage itself. So I'm going to briefly touch on plant viruses. Plant viruses are a very interesting group. They're largely transmitted by insects. Over 50% of plant viruses are transmitted by aphids, but there are other insects that can transmit them, can transmit some viruses, such as thrips or some leafhoppers and some whiteflies. So mostly it's hemipterans. Now there are other modes of transmission, but they tend to be less common as compared to insect transmission. But these do include like physical sap transmission. So this is if you were to cut an infected plant, you could then spread it on your shears to another plant. There is some seed transmission and pollen transmission viruses as well. The symptoms vary depending on the type or kind of virus or the host plant, but often what you'll get is a mosaic chlorotic pattern on the leaves. You'll get poor growth or stunting, and oftentimes there'll be some kind of distortion or deformation of the leaf tissue, and sometimes of the fruit. They often have very similar symptoms, so the only way to really know which virus you have is to test for it. But there are some that are just more common out there. So some of those more common ones are two viruses from the Tospoviridae group. These include tomato spotted wilt virus and Impatiens necrotic spot virus. So these two viruses are vectored by thrips, and they can cause a wide variety of symptoms, but generally speaking, you'll get chlorotic and necrotic lesions or rings on different host species, Sometimes you'll get these concentric circles, like on the fruit on the far left. And one of the big issues with these two viruses in particular is they have an incredibly wide host range. Tomato spotted wilt virus can infect over 1,000 plants, and in patients, necrotic spot virus can infect hundreds. And so weeds can serve as a reservoir, ornamental plants, and so these two are very common in the world of viruses, in the world of plant viruses. Some other important viruses out there is powdery viruses. So these are a lot of your mosaic viruses, like watermelon mosaic virus and lettuce mosaic virus and turnip mosaic virus. These are vectored by aphids. They have smaller host ranges, but they can still infect a number of crop types, but it tends to be a little more focused than those Tosloviridae viruses. Cucumber mosaic virus is specific. It's in a different family than some of the other mosaic viruses. It is a very common virus. It can cause vein clearing and that mosaic chlorosis. It is also vectored by aphids, and it has a pretty wide host range. Tobacco mosaic virus is in a different family as well, but it is probably the most well-known plant virus. Was the originally discovered virus, and it is very stable. So this is one of those viruses that can be trapped physically or sap transmitted to other plants from your shears or your equipment. It can also be vectored by insects like aphids as well. I find that tobacco mosaic virus is a little less common than the other viruses, like tomato spotted wilt virus, but tobacco mosaic virus does have a broad host range and can survive in weeds. Now, the good thing about control for viruses, or the bad thing, however you want to look at it, is that while determining the individual virus may be difficult, oftentimes the management is the same. There is no cure for virus infection in plants. Once a plant is infected, it will remain infected. And so it's recommended to discard infected plants. And prevention is really key here. So you want to make sure that the plants that you're getting don't already have virus, or the seeds that you're getting don't have seeds, depending on the crop type. The other important factor is sanitation. So using disinfectants when you're going from plant to plant and removing and destroying those infected plants. And this is primarily going to help with your staph transmissible viruses. And sanitation helps with a wide variety of plant diseases. So it's in general a good idea. And then lastly, for plant diseases, you can try to minimize insect infestations, but in actuality, in a home garden, you're not going to prevent hemipterans from being there. So if you can do things like yellow sticky traps, they can cut down on maybe the number of insects that are there. You can mitigate your chances of getting a plant virus. So now we're talking about Fusarium wilts. So Fusarium wilts, as the name might imply, is generally caused by Fusarium oxysporum. So fungi are very complicated, but essentially Fusarium oxysporum have different special forms, or forma specialis, where there are strains that are pathogenic, whereas the majority of Fusarium oxysporums that exist in a lot of soils throughout the world are unlikely to be pathogenic on many different types of plants. But when we find plants that are infected and we isolate that strain, those strains of Fusarium generally can only infect a very small range of plants. So the strains that do infect our plants can only infect very small ranges of host species when they're able to infect. So Fusarium Fusarium wilts occur on solanaceous plants like tomatoes, potatoes, cucurbits, legumes, cole crops, alliums, and others. So it's a very common disease. But these strains of Fusarium oxysporum are host specific in that your tomato Fusarium is not going to cause issue in your lettuce. Um, Symptoms of Fusarium wilts. So this is a vascular disease. It's going to appear as a one-sided necrosis and chlorosis or wilt. And this is because oftentimes the fungus will get into the vasculature in an ununiform amount. And so one side of the plant might have more in it, and those vasculature will become clogged. And that's where you will start seeing those symptoms. There will be vascular discoloration. And sometimes, if it's bad enough, you can see whitish or pink spores. Now, prevention is key for Fusarium as well, because there is no cure for a plant that has a Fusarium wilt in its vasculature. There are some cultivars that are resistant or tolerant of the Fusariums in certain capacities. So if you have a problem with Fusarium wilt of tomato, you can look for tomatoes that are more resistant to Fusarium wilt. The problem, fungi will evolve, so it's possible there's breaking, but that's always something that you can look into, is those resistant options. It is soil borne, and so once you have it, it is very difficult to get rid of, if not impossible. But there are some cultural controls that can help, increasing your drainage, making sure that the plants are having good drainage and not easily infected root system, because oftentimes it gets in at the root or crown. Avoid excess fertilizer, because that makes plants prone to disease. Removing infected material. Solarization can reduce that inoculum load and can help minimize issues that you might have with Fusarium wilt. But if you have a known issue in a certain area with Fusarium wilt, oftentimes it's better to just rotate that to a different crop that's not going to be susceptible. So next we have leaf spots. Leaf spots are a group of diseases caused by a number of fungal and bacterial pathogens. The most common bacterial pathogens are Pseudomonas and Xanthomonas, and the most common fungal pathogens are Alternaria, Septoria, and Cercospora. Oftentimes, these diseases don't kill plants. They're mostly just foliar diseases that can reduce production of the plant and reduce yield, because it's interfering with photosynthesis and things like that. But oftentimes these aren't death sentences for a plant, and they have a wide variety of vegetable plants get some sort of leaf spot. But again, for the most part, they aren't often going to kill a plant. There is some resistance here, but like with downy mildew, cultural control works well at controlling and managing leaf spots. So increasing airflow, reducing leaf moisture, because a lot of times excess leaf moisture is how the pathogens will get into that leaf and stay on that leaf. Minimize overhead watering and the sanitation, removing those infected leaves before you have a serious outbreak can help minimize your inoculum load. The last disease I'm going to talk about is damping off. So damping off is a group of diseases that occur in seedlings and can occur in all veg crop seedlings. It's mainly caused by Pythium and Rhizoctonia species in the soil. And so that's a water mold as well as a fungal pathogen. And these often occur because in our soil, there's so many microorganisms, and baby plants, seedlings are pretty susceptible. And so sometimes these things that maybe wouldn't be an issue on older plants, like the certain Pythium or Rhizoctonia species, will be able to affect or kill those seedlings because they're younger, tender growth. Oftentimes, it's more of an issue in an overly wet, compact soil. And this, like most like diseases, plant diseases in general, will not uniformly affect seedlings. So if you have 20 seedlings, only 8 of them might be affected by this damping off. But in general, it is a disease that causes almost disintegration or rot of the crown of seedlings of any type of veg crop. It can, as I said, it can occur on any type of veg crop. This, like downy mildew, like leaf spots, can be controlled with proper cultural methods such as sanitation, making sure you're removing dead plants. You're when you grow seedlings, growing them in the right type of media before. So making sure the compaction isn't as making sure the soil or media isn't compact so that they can grow and they're not too compact in that soil, and having the correct amount of irrigation can minimize the amount of issues that you have with damping off. Damping off can affect seedlings as well as newly germinated seeds. You can see on that picture on the left, even before seeds start to germinate, they might become affected with damping off if it is too wet and cool for those pathogens and the seeds aren't able to fight back. And so again, sanitation is very important with this. Cleaning your equipment, if you reuse pots for your seeds or trays for your seeds. And then lastly, having the correct temperatures. So hardening off seedlings before moving them outside, or making sure that they're not exposed to drastic temperature changes while they're in that little age is important at preventing damping off. So lastly, very briefly, going to talk about tying it all together. How you can take all this type of information and make decisions in your home gardens. So the first thing when you start seeing things on your plants is you want to ask yourself a few questions. What am I looking at? What is this host plant? What is the age of the plant? Is what the symptoms that I'm seeing on all of one cultivar, all in one species of plant? Is it only on certain ages of plants? Is the plant in a good location for it? The environmental conditions. What have the environmental conditions been like lately? Has there been a heat spell or a frost, or has the irrigation been proper for it? Or have I checked, is the fertilizer, are the symptoms consistent with a fertilizer need or nutrient deficiency? The third question is, are there other plants that are affected nearby? Is it the same species, different species? Usually a disease is going to affect one type of one species or closely related species of plants, versus disorders might affect an entire garden at once. And then the last question is, how quickly did this problem spring up? Is it and has it changed over the time that I've watched it? And this has to do with disease progression, and abiotic disorders oftentimes appear more suddenly. So I have this little disease disorder chart. So visible signs are going to be the signs that we mentioned at the beginning that are signs of a pathogen. That means you got a disease present. Symptoms of diseases tend to develop more slowly and won't happen all at once, versus disorders might take out a whole garden plot at one time if you have a heat spell or a frost spell. Diseases tend to be uneven, so you're not going to get 100% of your plants dead from a disease for the most part. It will happen more slowly and be more uneven. And then the last thing, again, is if you have more than one type of plant affected, then you could potentially be looking more at a disorder, because generally speaking, diseases are more host specific. So these are just some generalities to kind of help you take the symptoms that you're seeing and use those symptoms to make a decision on, are you looking at a disease? Are you looking at a disorder? And can you identify what disease or disorder by those symptoms? So that is all I have today. So I want to thank you guys.
Yes, thank you, Mackenzie, for the wonderful presentation.